This documentary was made with the goal of giving Americans and English-speaking people a short, easy to understand, and simple introduction to the work of the Italian intellectual Pier Paolo Pasolini. Because we believe that Pasolini has a lot to say to our culture, we would like to examine as much of his work as we can. But he was very prolific, and it's difficult to do that. He's also a controversial character who is often misunderstood. So, for the sake of simplicity, what we plan to do is to take a short look at his attitude towards documentary. Then we're going to take a look at our cultural background and how we would unconsciously perhaps consciously interpret some kind of a phenomenon from Italian culture, and that's what he is. And then we're going to look at a few of his movies, not all of them, and certainly not any of his poetry or novels, but just a couple of his movies. This is, by way of background, the city where he was born, Bologna, a northern Italian town. He was born in 1922, and he went to the university here in Bologna, where he picked up a lot of anti-fascist sentiment. And when the war broke out, he moved back to his mother's hometown of Casarsa della Delizia, in the Italian province of Friuli Venezia Giulia. It's a very proud, autonomous place. They even have their own language. And it's here that he began his career. Pasolini started out as a poet, and he loved poetry intensely, even when he realized that he could not make a living writing poetry because of the changes in the world. The world was becoming extremely television oriented. He remained very attached to poetry. Here he is pictured with another Italian poet, Sandro Penna. And Pasolini's cinematic style was so heavily influenced by the poetry that he read and wrote in his early intellectual career that some people have come to call his style cinema poesia, the cinema of poetry, even though he's grouped with other neorealists. He has his own poetic style of making films. Here he's pictured with the famous actress Anna Magnani, who was in one of his pictures. Since Pasolini had so much to say about film, it's not surprising that he had a lot to say about documentary film. And since this is a documentary, it might be a smart thing to take a look at what his position on documentary was. We find this in an interview he did, which is in a documentary directed by Philo Bregstein called Whoever Tells the Truth Shall Die. And in this documentary, Pasolini is discussing the assassination of John F. Kennedy. It's kind of ironic because later in life Pasolini would also be assassinated. But at that time, obviously, he was discussing John F. Kennedy's murder. And he said that 700 different individuals could make 700 different documentaries about the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And each one of those documentaries would be different. Only a detective, he says, if that detective had the chance to sift through all the evidence in that case, might be able to come up with the truth. So he says, I'm very interested in editing because just doing a straight representation of reality is not going to give the audience the kind of lesson that he wanted to give them. He was a teacher. He had the mind of a teacher, the soul of a teacher. He was an educator at heart. And so he was very concerned with the communication of a particular message, and he felt that documentary was one way to do that. Now, as we said, Pasolini is very self-aware. He's aware of his role as a communicator in his film directing. He wants to teach and communicate, but he was also very well aware of the recipient of these communications, the audience. And there was a rising middle class in Italy that he was very distressed about, because he felt that the audience he was trying to reach was this rising middle class, which was the result of the disappearance of a lot of ancient, archaic cultures that had a lot of beauty in them and remembrance and history. And the new culture that was taking the place of that was kind of homogenized, and it was based primarily on money and the acquisition of material goods, and kind of a forgetfulness and an ignorance of history and culture and faith. So he was distressed about this. He was continually engaged in addressing this issue and trying to do something about it, trying to speak out about it, and trying to reach as many people as he possibly could. Tu vuoi far l'America is a Neapolitan phrase meaning you want to be American. And of course, in some ways, everyone wants to be American, don't they? Or they did at that time, because America had won the Second World War with a lot of advanced weaponry. And maybe the fact that we printed a whole bunch of money to pay for that weaponry and all these other consequences that might be coming out now were not in evidence at that time. All anybody could think of was America had won the war and defeated Hitler, and people were ecstatic, and everybody wanted to adopt this American attitude. And Americans are the champions of the mass culture, the middle class, and the homogenization of everything. So, since we are American and we are the audience of this film, and we're looking at Pasolini, who was trying to impact the culture and make it less homogenized, we need to take a look at our collective psyche. What's in our mind when we hear the word Italian? Because that's going to affect how we perceive Pierpaolo. And so I think the very first thing that's in our minds when we hear the word Italian is probably funnier than you think. And since it's not appearing, I'm going to sing a rendition of Oh Beautiful. Oh, here we go. Pizza. That's what I wanted you to see. Pizza is a staggeringly popular phenomenon. It comes from Italy. It's all over the United States. In fact, it's all over the world. And it quite possibly could be one of the most, if not the most popular cultural icon of all time. Is it? I don't know. The man who founded Starbucks said in his autobiography he wanted to have a brand that was as ubiquitous as Coca-Cola. And a close second to pizza, which hasn't been branded so far, thank God, by one individual, is cappuccino, which unfortunately we tend to brand in our minds as Starbucks, but it isn't. Cappuccino in Italy is something that you get at an innumerable number of small roadside cafes, which preserve a quality of individualism that's not present in this country. If we're going to move up the ladder of culture a bit, we're going to talk about music. Italians are beautiful singers. We've gone from Sinatra and Mario Lanza to the pop opera genre with Pavarotti, and everybody knows Pavarotti. And we also know Bocelli. He's a beautiful singer. He's almost completely blind, but that has only served to endear him the more to the global culture that he is appealing to and has charmed and won over to his singing. The Italian fashion houses is another phenomenon that is widespread and very popular. Gucci is such a popular brand. It's not only present in all of our department stores, but we also have a rapper from the hip-hop culture who calls himself Gucci Mane. And as if Prada didn't want to be outdone, there is a movie called The Devil Wears Prada. So these fashion houses have insinuated themselves into our stores, into our own American cultures, and there they will remain. Another phenomenon that's very familiar to Americans is European football. The Italian soccer team, which is our name for football, won the World Cup in 2006, and it did a lot to spread this Italian and European football fever throughout the United States. And although Pasolini was an avid soccer player, he would not have loved the consumerization of this joyful sport. He wouldn't have liked that part of it. And he probably would have had something to say about Fabio, who was kind of a calendar phenomenon. He was one of these Italian model types, kind of macho and strutting himself all over the place. This is Sylvester Stallone. He's the icon of the disgruntled Vietnam veteran, Rambo, and also he popularized the underdog American boxer we know as Rocky. Rocky was a hero defeating the Russian boxer. This is the Jersey Shore, and again we see the repetition of this Italian kind of macho image, boardwalk, Jersey Shore. We've got loads of girlfriends and this and that. This is Fellini. He was a director, a contemporary of Pasolini, and he did a lot to popularize La Dolce Vita, which is translated the sweet life, because he was a very fluffy director. He did not concern himself with philosophy. The next topic, which is introduced into our culture by the Italians, is the notion of the criminal organized crime, the underworld. And this is Martin Scorsese, and he directed a film called The Gangs of New York, which was about violence in urban settings earlier in the history of our nation. Many people are familiar with Scorsese's face and name, but certainly not as many as the next director we're going to see, Coppola, Francis Ford Coppola, who directed the most popular Italian movie probably in American history, and it's called The Godfather, of course, and features Don Corleone, played by Marlon Brando. And this image of the Godfather is branded in our psyches. We can't really erase it, probably, for the foreseeable future. And the effect of this Godfather image that has been given to us and that we have taken is that we kind of unconsciously associate certain positive Italian traits like God and the church and the family and the close-knit nature of Italian families and honor, things of this nature. We almost unconsciously associate them with the underworld and crime and mystery and scandal, and all of these notions kind of creep quietly through the back door of our minds. This is The Sopranos, a popular TV show about the mob. We talk about pimping my ride on MTV, but we could talk about Schettino my ride, because another feature of Italian culture is, again, we tend to view Americans, the Italian culture, as kind of showy. And this is a perfect example of that. The Swiss Guards have these fantastic uniforms. They're unbelievable. Of course, the Protestants were told to shun this kind of beauty. But in the heyday of Catholicism, it was ubiquitous. It was all over the place. This is Michelangelo, again, another artist of great talent, and he presented works of art that are still a tourist attraction like no other. This is from the Sistine Chapel. Here is Schettino, the ship's captain. We love to grin and make fun of him because why? While he was a good-natured but drunken sailor. And the upshot of that was he got behind the wheel of this boat and wanted to show off. And did he think he was driving a sports car? Ferrari Enzo or a Lamborghini Zagata? We know that Italians produce some of the most beautiful sports cars in the world. And there's nothing like a headline saying man crashes Lamborghini into tree stump because he doesn't know how to drive it, that kind of thing. This is a juicy piece of gossip. The Pope's butler did it. Paolo Gabriele. I guess he was just a cleaning man in the Vatican City. He rose through the ranks, and now he's being accused of pilfering secret documents. So that's our Italy. That's the Italy that we have, for better or worse. And now we're going to take a look at Pasolini and his self-portrait, which is the way he wanted to present himself to us. That's right. And he does this in a 1963 movie called La Ricotta. And the reason this is so important is because he's deliberately choosing to create a movie within a movie, showcasing himself as the director of that movie, and putting words in the mouth of that director. That's what he's doing. So if we want to know what he thought about himself and what he wanted to tell people about himself, especially as a director, this is where we should go. This might surprise you, the actual presentation of the character of Pasolini, because we have become familiar with a certain type of film director, and he was not that. He was not your typical, and I hope I've made that point already, but I'll make it again. What was he then? What did he want to say about himself? Well, the first thing we have to know is that in the beginning of La Ricotta, he says he knows that he is going to be misunderstood. So he puts a proviso at the very beginning of the film saying, no matter what anybody thinks, the story of the Passion of Christ is to me the greatest story that ever happened. So he's identifying himself as a believer, and he's also saying he's not just any old believer. To him, he's a passionate believer. Now, he chose Orson Welles to play himself as the director, and the movie is about a poor man who is playing the part of the good thief in a Hollywood-style passion play. And the reason that the poor man shouldn't eat too many cannolis is because he dies from gorging himself on ricotta cheese. Now, this poor protagonist, whose name is Stracci, is a member of the vanishing archaic agricultural cultures that Pasolini loved so well, because to him they represented what he calls his intimate, profound, archaic Catholicism. Now, that's something I want you to keep in mind. Stracci, the protagonist of La Ricotta, is not only a Christ figure, he's not only a man who dies on a cross in this movie, he's also a good thief, a man who represents a blessed person who is promised paradise by God. But he is an icon of the vanishing faith that Pasolini loved so well. And here we see ricotta cheese in its homemade state. And Pasolini shows Stracci wolfing this particular kind of ricotta. Not a cannoli, not something we as Americans would be familiar with, but he wolfs down a bunch of ricotta that's being sold at a roadside stand, and it was probably made by a gentleman who looked an awful lot like this, in a work space that probably looked an awful lot like this. This is a photograph from Sicily in the 1970s, a man making ricotta cheese. So we can see that this picture that Pasolini wants to give us, that he puts in the mouth of his character. He tells a journalist who's giving him an interview that he wants, in this movie, he wants to tell the public about his intimate, profound, archaic Catholicism. That's what he wants to do. So again, we have to look at this and say, this is a message from him to us. Many people say that Pasolini was crazy, he's a Marxist, he's some kind of a freak, because he was mystical and he was trying to do something you can't do, go back in history, go forward in history, kind of mythologically elevate the proletariat and make Marxism into some sort of sacred religion. No, he's telling us that he wants to express his intimate, profound, archaic Catholicism. And he contrasts the work of Fellini with his own, because when the director says, "What do you think of Fellini?" he says, he dances, and you, the audience, are then presented with a picture of the cast of this movie dancing to jazzy music, while this poor individual, this beloved individual, Strachey, who is simply a hungry man who can't get enough to eat, and is noble and really and honest, is crucified literally by the Hollywood system. So the consumeristic system, it's not only killing us physically in the case of the poor farmers, it's destroying ways of life that Pasolini felt were necessary to preserve our humanity. These are the words of Jesus Christ, and I think it's easy to see that Pasolini, by making the hero of La Ricotta a poor man, and by making himself a director announcing his deep Catholic faith, as contrasted with this Hollywood frivolity and cruelty and consumerism, we can see what he's trying to tell us. He's trying to tell us exactly what Jesus is trying to tell us. Blessed are the poor, for the kingdom of God is theirs. Now, it's true that we can be poor in spirit and still have a lot of material goods. That's not what Pasolini was trying to say. He was trying to say that the middle class was being deceived. And the reason that he was so explicit in La Ricotta, so very explicit and so acid in his condemnation of Hollywood, has a lot to do with two movies that he made prior to La Ricotta. Both of these movies were about what he called the sub-proletariat. They were people who had been displaced from their farmlands by this rising consumerism, developers who put up the slums and only cared about, making money. And the residents of these areas simply had nowhere to go, so they ended up being banished to the most despicable and desperate conditions. And Pasolini took his camera into those slums and he filmed people in them. And the first movie that he made was Accattone, starring Sergio Citti, who was not a professional actor. And Accattone is a pimp. He's abusive, he's suicidal, he's impoverished, and these are the conditions that he lives in. And the second movie that Pasolini made, Mamma Roma, was almost a continuation of Accattone, because it featured the same actor, Citti, playing a pimp, but focused on a prostitute. So he was giving you the other end of the coin. And Anna Magnani played this role because Accattone had gotten critical acclaim from the cognoscenti, and so Anna Magnani was able to get her to play this role in the second movie, the role of the prostitute. And these movies are grim, they're gritty, they're realistic, not because he was trying to be a neo-realist, but he was trying to tell the truth about the conditions of the life that these people were living and bring it to the attention of the middle class. And both the movies end sadly. They don't have happy endings. In fact, they're tragic endings. However, if we look at a film pic that's coming up, we're going to see this suicidal man standing on the bridge of angels, and significantly, again, there's an image of the cross. There's an angel, and those who know history know that this bridge has a series of angels who are holding instruments of torture that they gave to Christ before he died. So these movies are also about the Passion of Christ, Acatone and Mama Roma, because Pasolini sees Christ in these people. And if we doubt the theological soundness of that, we just have to go to St. Paul falling off his horse and Jesus saying, "Why do you persecute me?" And famously, he identified himself so completely with the church that he didn't say, "Why are you persecuting my followers?" He said, "Why are you persecuting me?" So the scandal that people took at La Ricotta, because it was such an acid satire, perhaps we should remember that Christ himself was causing a great deal of scandal in the Mediterranean scene where he was preaching by the seas of Galilee and in the temple, and he was scandalizing a lot of different people. And he even scandalized his cousin, who was one of his best friends, and had announced to the world that there goes the Lamb of God. But sometime later, when he was arrested, he became scandalized by the behavior of Jesus, because Jesus was associating himself so deliberately with the suffering of this world. And so John the Baptist sends messengers to Jesus and says, "Are you really the Christ? Because if you are," this is implied, "why don't you get me out of jail? Why are you letting me risk being martyred here? You're my friend," and the scandal is there. And Christ's response is, "I'm doing miracles. I'm doing what I was sent here to do, and you are blessed if you do not take offense at that." So essentially, the movies that Pasolini had made up to that point, 3 movies about poor people, the third a direct lesson to the public. I am a director, and I want to tell you about my intimate, profound, archaic Catholicism. You haven't understood that in the first 2 movies. Maybe I wasn't being clear enough. But in this third movie, I'm telling you who I am, what my message is. And I think every other movie we ever see, or every other piece of poetry we ever read by Pasolini, or novels, should be interpreted with this self-portrait in mind. And the last movie he did that we're going to discuss is this Gospel of St. Matthew. After he did La Ricotta, Pope John the 23rd invited him to come to a